Luli confirmed she would send the footage and asked what else she could do. Song Zikyong emphasized calmness and gave Luli authority to handle tasks in her stead. Luli admitted the shock she felt earlier had diminished since she first saw a zombie. She said accepting the possibility of zombies eased her fear and clarified her focus. Chen Bai's phone vibrated and he answered with mild surprise. He called out to the caller as Song Zikyong and listened. Song Zikyong walked along a street and pressed him about returning home and about her mother. He introduced himself as Chen Bai and asked why he had her mother's phone. He then softened his tone, smiled, and claimed her mother was busy working and eating and could not talk. He urged Song Zikyong to come home so they could speak, stressing the visit was important. Song Zikyong walked along the street and called Chen Bai, pressing him to come home. She held the phone and scolded him for missing her messages and calls. She then realized the handset belonged to her mother and grew angry and embarrassed. Meanwhile, Chen Bai sat indoors with a woman kneeling at his feet and listened. The kneeling woman begged him to protect her daughter and explain the child's condition. Chen Bai smiled and promised he would watch over her and reduce the child's risk. The woman bowed her head and thanked her master with visible relief. At a suburban secret warehouse, two women argued over Chen Bai's credibility. Woman in cloak accused others of being deceived by Chen Bai. Long-haired woman fell silent and complied with instructions. Later, Chen Bai arrived and followed green-haired woman up a stairwell into the building. Green-haired woman reported her city survey and said only this site matched the rumors. She explained the place was a former underground casino turned into a zombie house. She estimated about 160 infected and noted no special nest heads. Chen Bai listened and considered the information. Continuing from the warehouse dispute, the team inspected the converted casino site and compared notes. The protagonist scanned the courtyard and noted a zombie silhouette. He argued nearby hospitals could not explain it. He emphasized the site's remoteness and difficulty of access. Green-haired woman affirmed her city survey and said only this location matched the rumors. She recalled estimating about 160 infected and finding no distinct nest heads. She suggested someone was deliberately collecting infected specimens. The protagonist wondered whether the person was a curious adventurer or a resourceful broker worth tracking. The protagonist approached the door and ordered it opened with a calm voice. He slid his hand across the lock and pushed the panel aside slowly. A gaggle of infected lunged out as the wood creaked and split. Their eyes glowed red and hands clawed for anyone nearby. Bystanders outside had no warning and were struck down in an instant. The protagonist stepped back and raised his arms to shield himself and others. Bodies fell and blood spattered across the courtyard and the wall. He scanned for exits and prepared to fight before the horde could regroup. The protagonist had forced the door and met the exploding horde head-on. He dodged a leaping infected and knocked the creature aside with a swift strike. The impact sprayed dust and blood across the yard. Two women in the doorway gasped and raised their phones in shock. Then an unseen hand descended and pressed on a nearby man's head. Violet light wrapped his skull and his eyes flared with purple. The light spread through the room and crawled into the fallen bodies and machines. Corpses twitched and metal joints spasmed as a single figure rose above them suspended by violet force. The protagonist had breached the room and watched reanimated bodies twitch under violet force. He moved through the wreckage and found a glowing panel labeled the Zombie Virus Serum Formula. A prompt asked to unlock the file. He tapped yes, and the data revealed the serum's ability to be carried by infected hosts. He warned of the transfer risk, called Song Zikyong to summon allies, and watched 4 armed women assemble in the doorway as he readied their next move. The protagonist had opened the door and found 4 armed women standing in the hallway. Woman in cloak held a bat and warned that cold weapons cut infection risk during close combat. She said killing unarmed infected could still twist a person into a monster. She asked to see their strength and invited someone to go first. The protagonist stepped in and faced a snarling infected while the captive tensed. The protagonist watched as green-haired woman launched at the snarling infected and drove him to the ground. The impact broke the attacker's jaw, and blood sprayed across the pavement. The protagonist observed silently and muttered a brief clinical appraisal about the strike. He noted the attacker's speed, ruthless timing, and precise strike placement overall. Another woman finished the motion with a bat while the protagonist stood back. He then assessed the creature's resilience and judged the force insufficient to kill swiftly. It had fallen from one clean hit, yet still needed many more strikes to end. The infected hit had shattered its jaw and sprayed blood across the pavement. Green-haired woman drove the creature down with a precise strike. Another woman finished the motion with a bat. The protagonist watched from above and offered a clinical appraisal of timing and impact. He judged the blow severe, yet inadequate to kill the creature. The crowd forced a frightened woman forward and called for her to act. They demanded Songji take the next strike. Songji knelt, gripped the bat, and whimpered that she could not do it. The protagonist watched and judged the attempt a failure. Woman in cloak stepped forward and called Song Ziqiang over. He approached and stood beside her. She noted Songji's terror and inability to strike. She said she lacked time to train Songji slowly and told the protagonist to arrange practice for her. He replied yes. She then questioned why he had not neutralized the virus and pressed the point sternly. Finally, she handed him a small item and told him to take it. They left the scene while bystanders continued to mutter. The protagonist took the sheet and read the diagrams and notes aloud to himself. Woman in cloak presented a detailed page labeled Zombie Virus Serum Formula with precise steps. She explained the process and offered him the formula to safeguard and complete. He accepted responsibility and promised to arrange practice for Songji as requested. She instructed him to wait while she left and told him whom to contact. As they departed, he worried his post might already have been seen by many. The protagonist had taken the formula and lingered, still worried his post was exposed. He checked his phone and found a long forwarded text about verdant grasslands. The message described an expedition and odd characters in blunt, clipped lines. He smiled and asked aloud what kind of stuff it was now. A notification cut the quiet, and he opened private messages immediately on his screen. A sender denied being a shill and argued about visibility on Lei. He realized not everyone was from his circle and considered his response. He put the phone away and planned his next steps tonight cautiously. He reopened his phone and scrolled through the private messages again tonight. The group chat welcomed Han Zio with a blunt short message on screen. He read the forwarded lines and tracked names through clipped replies across threads. Mentions of Pioneer and Shuchuan stood out and triggered sudden recognition. Earlier private notes referenced a white emperor and a man named Chen Bai. He matched those fragments and suspected the Pioneer was not ordinary. An image loaded showing a white-haired figure amid swirling water. The caption named the figure Suikyun, an emperor-level powerhouse. The revelation sank in. He suspected the Pioneer was Suikyun. He read the short reply that allowed him to invite other pioneers. He tapped the screen, composed a short invite, and sent it into the group. His smile widened, and he let out a short laugh as he awaited any response. The phone chimed as the group turned the message into an announcement. A bold red panel declared Shuchuan welcomed to the chat group on screen. The new entry confirmed a connection between the names he had matched earlier. He set the phone down and watched the chat feed, waiting for further replies. He set the phone down and watched the chat feed as replies were expected. At 7:30 p.m. two women met in a narrow alley to trade investigation updates. They discussed collected zombies and named the Nankai container yard near Jiangcheng Wharf. One woman said all seized subjects were sent there while field teams tracked movements. Suddenly, a heavy crash split the ceiling and a figure fell into the room. The woman reacted, leapt, pinned the intruder, and stamped his face into the floor. The man screamed as blood sprayed, and the alley filled with violent noise. He sat cross-legged on a ceiling beam and laughed down at the ruined room below. The woman below froze when she heard the sound and turned toward the light. He offered a mocking greeting and stayed perched watching her reaction. Her face shifted from resolve to shock as she admitted that she had been discovered. The view then cut outward to a sunlit manor labeled Song Zikyong's mansion. The final panel showed a phone screen with a chat feed. The phone's pending reply tied the alley encounter to ongoing messages and the broader investigation. He sat on a couch in a sunlit room and scrolled his phone. A purple status box declared the ability was S5 level. A green dialogue explained spirit activation costs and strict restrictions. Footsteps echoed in the hall and a cloaked woman entered the room. She reported Lu Lei had traced the collection zones to Song Zikyong's mansion. He told her to get up and asked if Lu Li had given them up. She stammered that Lu Li was caught and currently negotiating terms. He stared and demanded confirmation as her eyes widened in alarm. He had been seated in a sunlit room scrolling his phone when the cloaked woman reported Lu Li's trace to Song Zikyong's mansion. She said Lu Li had been captured and was negotiating terms. He demanded confirmation. She knelt and insisted Lu Li would not betray them, citing her humanity and loyalties. He resolved to rescue Lu Lei and ordered her brought to safety. The woman thanked him. The scene shifted to a container yard where two men sat at a table. One introduced himself as Xing Meng and warned the other he misunderstood the situation, hinting at coercive options for Lu Lei. He left the container yard and entered an ornate room with high windows. Boss Song smiled close and said they would all be his playthings soon. An unknown woman sat tied to a chair with a shattered wine glass beside her. Red wine liquid spread across the wooden floor near her bound feet. A man forced the girl to toast and warned her not to spit. He stepped on the broken glass and commented that punishment wine tasted bad. A hand reached toward a small plate as the scene lingered on brutality. The protagonist watched from the doorway and thought the girl disliked drinking. He left the container yard and entered the ornate room where Boss Song sat with the bound woman. Red wine pooled near her feet beside a shattered glass on the wooden floor. The protagonist moved inward carrying a plate and offered a plain steak to break the silence. Boss Song watched and raised his glass while others noted Song Zikyong had sent 4 men. The protagonist said he had come to take the woman home, and she smiled despite her restraints. Boss Song labeled him a pioneer, and the room's tension tightened around the exchange. He exited the container yard and entered the ornate room where Boss Song sat beside a bound woman. A broken glass lay on the wooden floor near a small pool of red wine. The protagonist stepped forward carrying a plate and offered a plain steak. She smiled despite her restraints as others watched the exchange in silence. Boss Song remarked that Song Zikyong already answered to the protagonist and leaned forward. The protagonist confirmed the claim with a steady gaze. Boss Song grinned and called the situation interesting before pouring wine into 2 glasses. He spoke of the city's major powers and the queen's likely reluctance to yield. He offered to share plans and invited the protagonist to help him claim Jiangcheng's throne. The protagonist walked into the ornate room and watched Boss Song raise 2 glasses. Boss Song called for a toast, but the protagonist refused. A glass shattered on the floor and dark liquid spilled. Boss Song smirked and boasted of an S-level talent while offering punishment wine. The protagonist then scanned the room and said he had looked around before coming. He accused Boss Song of not only collecting zombies, but of creating infected people. The room tightened as the accusation hung in the air, and Boss Song's smile did not falter. The protagonist stood his ground, while Boss Song continued to mock him in the ornate hall. Boss Song said such an ability made its owner dangerous and undeserving of assistance. The protagonist calmly announced his talent was SSS level and named it Slaughter Progression. He displayed a blue crystalline claw and said the power could permanently siphon attributes from killed targets and grow without limit. A rival scoffed that even top abilities were only S-level and teased becoming a god. The protagonist smiled and refused to explain further. The earlier accusation about creating infected people lingered over the room. The rival lunged and hurled crystalline claws toward the protagonist in the hall. He yelled that the protagonist would increase his attributes after death soon. The attack struck the floor and exploded with pale light and dust. The protagonist's slaughter progression manifested as a purple aura from his back. The aura carved the ground and sent sharp tendrils after the assailant. He then shed his jacket and turned feral as muscles and veins bulged. Blue light flared in his eyes, and his grin sharpened into teeth. The hall fell silent as the protagonist prepared to claim more strength. The rival taunted the protagonist about his shape-shifting talent and weak strength. The protagonist noted the skill seemed incomplete and stayed highly cautious. The rival lunged, claws aflame with pale blue energy, and screamed. The protagonist's slaughter progression burst as a purple aura from his back. He shed his jacket, muscles bulged, and his grin sharpened into teeth. He struck back with a concentrated pulse of violet light and force. The blast carved the floor and knocked the rival backward across the hall. Silence fell, both prepared for the next brutal exchange. The rival taunted the protagonist about his shape-shifting and weak strength, then lunged with burning claws. The protagonist remained cautious and alert, noting the rival's technique still felt incomplete. His slaughter progression flared, releasing a purple aura from his back as he shed his jacket. Muscles coiled and his grin sharpened into razor teeth as he launched his strike. A concentrated pulse of violet light slammed into the rival and carved grooves into the floor. The blast ripped up debris and hurled the rival backward across the hall with force. Silence fell as both fighters steadied and prepared for the next brutal exchange. The rival taunted the protagonist about his shape-shifting and weak strength before lunging. The protagonist stayed cautious and watched the rival's technique for unfinished flaws. His slaughter progression flared as he shed his jacket and summoned purple energy. A concentrated pulse of violet light struck the floor and carved deep grooves. The blast ripped up debris and sent the rival tumbling across the container yard. Smoke and dust curled under the moon while the protagonist advanced with a charged hand. Both fighters landed and steadied themselves, preparing for the next brutal exchange. The rival launched downward with a charged strike from above, aiming for the protagonist's head. The protagonist answered with slaughter progression energy, purple flames coiling around his arm and fist. Their blows connected in a burst that ripped dust and light across the container yard. The rival landed nearby and grinned while breathing heavy, claiming the protagonist lacked strength. He taunted him as an SSS talent and demanded he stop hiding his power. The protagonist steadied himself, purple aura pulsing, and prepared to escalate the fight. The rival had launched down with a charged strike aimed at the protagonist's head. The protagonist had answered with slaughter progression energy, purple flames coiling around his arm and fist. Their clash ripped dust and light across the container yard. The rival landed and taunted him for hiding his strength. The protagonist steadied, purple aura pulsing, and then declared he was already using his talent. The rival barked an angry denial. The protagonist then surged, dark blue energy gathering at his hands, his expression hardening as power visibly spiked. The rival had driven the fight and knocked the protagonist backward, then stood over him and sneered. He mocked the protagonist for posing as strong while his body and speed lagged. He drove a crushing stomp and declared the protagonist's tricks meaningless before absolute power. Dust and smoke curled from the impact, and a hole marked where the blow landed. The protagonist coughed and struggled to rise, winded but alive. Dark blue energy still coiled around his hand and fingers. He kept his focus as the rival loomed above. The rival had dominated the exchange and left the protagonist gasping on the floor. He towered above and spat taunts as blue energy coiled around his hands. The protagonist struggled to stand, chest heaving and focus narrowed. Purple panels appeared, each marked with shifting text and numbers. The panels listed effects and stat changes readable at a glance. He registered the data with a stunned croak, and panic crept in. The balance of the fight shifted as new weaknesses and boosts became clear. The protagonist staggered as a purple notification panel materialized listing several new debuffs. He read fear of light and water, abnormal body temperature, slowed thinking, and slow movement. Panic tightened his chest while the rival smirked and declared the virus at last worked. The rival praised the protagonist's physique, then taunted him about having many illnesses. The protagonist rose on shaking legs, voice raw, and accused the rival of being sneaky. The rival's hand crackled with dark energy as he struck a brutal attack. The blow slammed the protagonist back down while the room blurred with motion. No rescue came before the assault resumed, and the gap in their balance widened. The protagonist staggered as a purple notification panel listed new debuffs on him. He felt fear of light and water, abnormal temperature, slowed thinking, and heavy movement. Panic tightened his chest while the rival smirked and declared the virus had succeeded. The rival praised the protagonist's physique, then taunted him about his many illnesses. He struck with crackling dark energy and slammed the protagonist back across the room. No one rescued him before the assault resumed, and the balance between them widened. A shadowed purple mass formed, wrapped the protagonist, and the rival said he would absorb him. He smiled and ordered the protagonist not to disappoint him. The system announced the black light virus had fully awakened, and that an evolved devouring ability now existed, able to probe targets' memories. Purple tendrils writhed as attributes shifted from active bonuses into permanent base values. The protagonist inspected his new statistics, noting each core attribute had risen by 20 points and seeing the updated talent and coin counts. He smiled and confirmed the additions had been applied to his basic attributes, while the panel listed his title, level, and the virus's monarch classification. The system announced the black light virus had awakened and a devouring ability existed. Purple tendrils shifted attribute sources into permanent base values. The protagonist reviewed his statistics and confirmed each core attribute rose by 20 points. He then inspected a fallen survivor's gear and crouched to pick up clawed equipment. The panel displayed the item stats, agility bonuses, and active skills, alongside a linked sea-level biohazard production blueprint. He concluded the original owner must have slain mutant zombies to obtain those parts, and noted that person's luck attribute must have been high. The system had announced the black light virus awakening and permanent attribute shifts to base values. Purple tendrils altered attribute sources, and the protagonist confirmed each core stat had risen by 20 points. He inspected a fallen survivor's gear and took the clawed equipment for himself. The item's display revealed agility bonuses, active skills, and a linked sea-level biohazard production blueprint. He concluded the original owner must have slain mutant zombies and enjoyed exceptional luck. He walked among shards of broken glass while the city moon watched. His talent had climbed from E to SSS, and he had seized Song Zikyong's identity. After seizing Song Zikyong's identity and rising to SSS, the protagonist moved through broken glass. A well-dressed woman in cloak opened a car door and urged him to enter, calling him master. He regarded his current strength and judged hunting the random monsters unwise before the trial. Glass shards littered the street while the moon hung over the city. He did not seek risk for minor gains when larger trials awaited. He remembered the black light virus shifts and the purple tendrils that altered his attributes. The last days before the advent pressed forward, narrowing every choice. The protagonist stood framed in purple flame and declared plans to prepare after the advent. He did not seek small gains and resolved to consolidate power before taking risks. The scene cut to Song Zikyong's villa, a quiet base shown by a single caption. A black text panel announced the trial and narrowed his options further. He stood on the villa balcony and watched the lit city in silence. He recalled the black light virus shifts and purple tendrils that altered his attributes. The last days before the advent pressed forward and choices grew narrower. A red caption declared the threat would soon be upon them. The protagonist stood in the foyer and invited the arrivals inside. A door creaked as three women stepped forward, led by a confident figure in a dark cloak. They addressed him as master and reported that every assigned task had been completed on schedule. One agent presented confirmed intelligence on terrain and population size in the target area. The mood tightened as the report closed and the looming warning hung over them. A red caption warned the threat would arrive soon. The protagonist stood in the foyer and welcomed the arrivals inside. Three women stepped forward, led by a cloaked, confident figure. They addressed him as master and reported that every assigned task had been completed. One agent presented confirmed intelligence on terrain and population size in the target area. A smiling assistant outlined their post-doomsday plan to seize control. The pink-haired staffer confirmed that material purchases were finalized and that lists had been sent. The cloaked leader said the three had confirmed prearrangements. The protagonist accepted the report and ordered all information placed on the table. A red caption warned the trials would arrive soon. The protagonist read the warning on his phone and stood silent. Group members answered across the city as minutes ticked down. A blue-haired woman thanked the leader and reported 9 minutes. A weightlifter pumped iron and claimed 8 minutes. A masked member on a rooftop urged calm at 7. A pink-haired girl admitted she was nervous at 6 minutes. Chat icons then showed the leader's 5-minute reminder and a crow handle replying they looked forward to it. Messages had counted down across the city, and the protagonist read them on his phone. Earlier group members had reported minutes left as the leader urged readiness. A dark-haired woman stepped forward and invited everyone to look. The display cut to 10 seconds, then flashed 0009 in red numerals. On a rooftop, several figures gathered, and one warned that the quiet scene would soon be history. The digital timer slipped to 0007 while the protagonist and the others watched the city lights and held their positions. Citywide messages had been counting down, and the protagonist watched on his phone as red numerals advanced. The display reached 0006, and a voice declared the world was ending. A pale woman admitted she was scared and called out to Sister Suhanger. Unknown woman told her not to be afraid. The timer fell to 0004 while the protagonist and the group held positions and stared at the skyline. Close-ups showed green-haired woman and pink-haired woman bracing themselves. At 0003, a young woman gripped papers with trembling hands. At 0002, a brown-haired woman forced a steadying breath and waited for what came next. Citywide messages had counted down while the protagonist watched his phone and the red numerals fell. At 0006, a broadcast voice declared the world was ending. A pale woman confessed fear and called for Sister Suhanger. Unknown woman told her not to be afraid. The timer dropped to 0004 as the group held positions and stared at the skyline. Close-ups showed green-haired woman and pink-haired woman bracing. At 0003, a young woman gripped trembling papers. At 0002, a brown-haired woman forced a steady breath. At 0000, the protagonist faced the darkened skyline and a red world labeled Advent of the Trial.